This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. Okay, a bit of news from me first of all. As regular listeners will know, Siobhan has recorded her last ever episode of Knowing Animals. She's now passed the mic on to me. Quite literally, in fact, as she posted her recording equipment to me. In the coming months, I'm going to be looking into a light rebranding of Knowing Animals to reflect that fact, so watch this space. But the format will definitely remain the same. I'll still be talking to animal studies scholars about their research, I'll still be asking them 5 quick questions, and I'm still going to like knowing animals. Quick shout out to our sponsors. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. And I'm particularly excited to be talking to one of ASA's inaugural prize winners today, but more about that in a second. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. It was great to hear Siobhan talking to Rowena Lennox in a recent episode. And that was about a book from the Animal Publics book series. Now, many of you will know that this year Siobhan established a series of animal studies prizes with ASA. And I can't think of any more appropriate person to follow on from Siobhan's final episode than the inaugural winner of the prize for popular communication of animal studies. That's Claudia Hirtenfelder, host of the wonderful podcast The Animal Turn, which, with Knowing Animals, is a member of the iRaw network. As well as being a podcaster, Claudia is a PhD student in the Department of Geography at Queen's University in Canada. Today we're going to talk about her paper Milking Economies, Multi-Species Entanglements in the Infant Formula Industry. This was co-authored with Caroline Proudest and was published online first in the journal Environment and Planning E, Nature and Space. By the way, this is an open access paper, so you're able to read it, download it and share it with everyone you know, free of charge, even if you don't have access to a university library. Welcome to the podcast, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Josh, for having me. It's really, thank you. Thank you for, I can't say enough. I'm thrilled to be here. And you can hear the dogs are thrilled to be here too.
Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about podcasting later on, but let's start by talking about this paper. So what led you to work on the topic of infant formulas?
So this paper is rather interesting. As you just said now, I am enrolled as a PhD student at Queen's University, and I went to Queen's with an interest in cows. And I'd never done animal studies before. So I went there thinking, actually, I was going to look at cows and their relationships to rivers in Botswana and how things have changed. But I got to Kingston, and with my interest in cows, someone immediately said to me, well, they spoke to me about a recent thing that happened with cows in Kingston, which was the closing of the prison farms. The prison farms had cows. They had a dairy thing where prisoners worked with cows. And then that was closed a few years ago by the Conservative government. But this was a really big event in Kingston. So my supervisor had said, why don't you look into that? So I started reading up a bit about the history of that and then found that, there's this milk plant being built in Kingston very soon, and these farms are reopening. And this got me thinking about the cows involved in the situation. And it was all centered around an infant formula factory. And then another, who's now also a co-supervisor, Caroline Proudest, is also interested in milk and milking economies, but actually around human milk and how human milk is used in infant feeding, as well as a variety of different economies. And we got talking just about how interesting this facility is, in that it brings together these two kind of ideas, human feeding, but also cow's milk, and interestingly, goat milk. And this got us really thinking now, okay, wow. So you've got goats, cows, humans, all coalescing in this specific space around infant feeding. And at the same time, I'm busy reading about my PhD, which is centered around the relationship between cows and the urban, particularly around some of the historical dimensions of that. And something that just comes up time and again is how the dairy industry, or the emergence of the dairy industry, was also related to the feeding of infants in cities. So all of these things kind of coalesced at exactly the right moment for us to say, okay, wow, this is fascinating, and it's happening in the city, Kingston, where we're both living. So what does this mean? So we started to look at it. What are some of these milking economies, and how do they implicate different species? And yeah, this paper was born of kind of excited conversations about where our different interests meet.
Well, that's fascinating. And you're talking about a lot of things that really excite me and about things that we've talked about a lot on Knowing Animals in the past. So let's start with this issue of the plant, the infant formula plant that's being
Mm-hmm.
built in Kingston, or has now been built perhaps. So what's the story there? Because there's a big international element to this as well, isn't there?
Exactly. And so this is not just any plant. Oops, now I've got a cat visiting me. This is really a Knowing Animals episode. That's Felix. This is a very international dimension in that it's not just an infant formula plant that is born of Canada, but it's actually a deal, and it's an international deal that's one of the biggest foreign direct investments in Canada. And that's Feihe, a Chinese infant formula company that's been trying to diversify its plants and its production. And it's done this in a variety of different ways. It's been setting up nutritional laboratories in Boston. It's setting up a whole bunch of new facilities across China. And the reason for this is in response to the 2008 melamine scandal, where several infants their kidneys were damaged. Over 300 infants' kidneys were damaged due to tainted infant formula in the country. And this sent the Chinese industry reeling. People were no longer trusting Chinese infant formula brands. They were actively seeking out foreign brands. So now you've got a situation where the Chinese government is trying to actively look for companies that it can invest in and get the Chinese industry of infant formula moving. And at exactly the same time, Canada has kind of this excess of skim milk, which is really important to infant formula. And they struck up a deal, a really big deal. And this brings together not only these two countries, China and Canada, but it's also the first infant formula plant in North America that is centered on goats, because Canada doesn't have an established goat dairy industry. Yes, there is stuff centered around cheese, and even that is quite small, but nothing around fluid goat's milk or goat's milk for infant formula. So this is really new across North America, and it's certainly new in Canada. And here it is in this really small town well, not small, a medium-sized city in Canada. So you've got these two countries coming together. You've got Canada and you've got China coming together in need of a product. They all meet here at this plant, which produces both cow-based infant formula, which is kind of the regular product in the industry, and goats-based infant formula. And yes, the plant is now up and functioning, and there's been several scandals actually around it since its opening, which follows when our paper was released. And there are now more and more entanglements that we would like to explore.
So how did you go about exploring this deal and this development of a new partnership?
So again, there was something really productive in myself and Carolyn coming together, because while we're both geographers, and I'll put in scare quotes, human geographers, which could just easily be like animal geographers because humans are animals, but that aside, we have different orientations that overlap in interesting ways. So Carolyn is an economic geographer with anti-colonial roots. She's interested in how economies work and how they've been shaped by the history of colonialism across North America, whereas I am interested in animal studies and how animals have been kind of centered in these economies as well. But I also have a historical interest and how space has been shaped historically. So through these interests of ours, different entanglements started to emerge. What became apparent is kind of the history of milk and the generation of milk and how that's shaped through a lot of racist and colonial ideas. So milk literally came to North America because cows were introduced to North America. Because of our different sensitivities, we were able to kind of decenter the focus on purely how the introduction of dairy was a colonial product versus what would have been my focus, how the introduction of cows emerged as a dairy industry. And we were able to kind of bring these two things together and say, okay, well, there's this interesting thing happening where the introduction of cows, some racist rhetorics around what whiteness means and how the consumption of milk actually constitutes a superior and civilized body, how these come together. And interestingly, how they come together around the idea of digestibility in more recent history. So the consumption of dairy was initially seen as a very European / English / white thing to do. It was indicative of civilization. And obviously there are a lot of kind of racist undertones here. It was really important that there was milk. So cows were introduced because milk and cows were really essential to the colonial project, right? But then in more recent history, it emerged that most people cannot actually consume milk. So now this kind of puts a new slant on that. So we became interested in kind of the digestibility of milk. And this is translated into interesting ways in infant formula as well, because goat's milk is viewed as being more digestible. So they're able to kind of create these more, in scare quotes, digestible infant formulas. So that was the first entanglement. So we unpacked a first entanglement that was centered around looking at race, genetics, purity, and milk in particular. And we imbricated onto that. So we weren't trying to collapse these two narratives together. We imbricated onto that a second entanglement. And this entanglement was now centered around the idea of motherhood and scientific motherhood in particular, because happening parallel is kind of this idea that to be a good mother, you have to feed your child in a particular way. And this has been increasingly scientized across time, both in terms of how infant formula is put forward, but also in terms of other feeding practices. Even if you're breastfeeding, there's a particular science and scientific narrative that's put forward. And there's this idea of scientific motherhood that was put forward by Apple, the Scholar, not the PC brand. That got me thinking about scientific motherhood and animals, because actually animals have been shaped by scientific ideas of scientific motherhood, but in a very different way to how humans have been. And this coalesces again in another entanglement here. So cows and goats have been scientized. Their bodies have been scientized. They've been invested in. They've been genetically modified when they're allowed to feed, who they're allowed to feed, the fact that their babies are taken away from them. This is all shaped by scientific and scientized ideas. So we thought, well, bring these things together: science, advertising, motherhood. So we've got these two entanglements: race, dairy, milk, history, and we've also got the focus on science and motherhood and marketing. And we thought it would be really neat to imbricate them, not collapse them to one another, because you get really interesting insights, both in terms of geography and history when you do that.
Yeah, so this method of imbrication is something that I've come across in animal studies a few times, but I think it's something that's quite hard to put your finger on sometimes. What do you understand that imbrication to mean?
Yeah, so I think both of the words we used in this paper, that centered the paper, entanglement and imbrication, come up a fair deal. How entanglement has tended to be used has sometimes been a bit over romanticized, right? The idea of becoming with, that as long as we're in partnership with each other, things are good. And this is somewhat problematic. So when What Comes After Entanglement came out, Gerard's work, I think this was really a breakthrough book that helped us question entanglement a bit as well. So we structured things around the idea of inclusions, exclusions, and typologizations, which these two entanglements that I discussed earlier, we look, how are people and animals differently included, excluded, and in effect made or typologized through the ideas of race, milk, science, motherhood. But these are not one and the same. So imbrication, while it's frequently used, we found that unlike entanglement, hasn't been given a lot of attention. What does it actually mean when you're talking about imbrication? It's kind of a word that's there but not unpacked. And we realized that for us, this is really a methodological concept, whereas entanglement helps us to think through these inclusions, exclusions, and typologizations. Imbrication provides us a way of presenting it and of putting them without collapsing them to one another, like roof tiles. So imbricate is actually related to roof tiles. You know how you'll have one roof tile that's overlaid just on top of another one, but not completely. So they're helping to form the same structure. There's something that's structurally relevant about their relationship to one another, but they're not one and the same tile. And just like this, the relationships between race and dairy and the history of cows in North America and across the world, really, and the relationship between infant formula and science and feeding are not one and the same, but they are shaping one another and shaping this deal and what makes deals like this foreign direct investment possible in the first place. And there is value in putting them together. And there are more entanglements, I think, that could be imbricated onto this to kind of give not a complete, but a much fuller picture of the nuance and complexity that's involved in making these possible.
Yes, I see entirely. And I hear what you say about the history and the context of North America, because one of the things that really fascinated me about this article is that you talked about, or you contrasted, the way that milk has been talked about in North America with the way it's talked about historically and contemporaneously in China.
Mm-hmm.
So In what ways do these histories or these presents perhaps differ from Western Europe, North America to China?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's something that did come up in the paper. It was how, at least in Chinese narratives, the consumption of dairy, but also the consumption of infant formula in particular, is shaped by both westernized narratives and narratives of Chinese narratives that have a long and ancient history, right? So the consumption of dairy in China is not as not as new, I think, as a lot of people think. Actually, the consumption of a variety of different animal milks is fairly ancient in China, but this was used primarily for medicinal purposes. And this has continued to kind of shape the ideas of milk as being a healthy product. But then you have, conflict or tension, at least, between communism and capitalism starting to emerge. And dairy ends up playing a really interesting role there historically, where in China, at least, there were these images being shown of America, the United States, and North America generally kind of discarding and throwing away milk. And this was the idea of consumerism and capitalism and how wasteful it is, and that actually the governments are not taking care of their people. And milk was used as kind of a fulcrum around which to have this discussion and to say, listen, that's not okay. We're looking after our people by actively giving milk and saying, you are allowed milk, this population is allowed milk. And one of those populations were infants. And this continues today in kind of these narratives of how milk and infant formula are consumed in China. It's both shaped by westernized and scientized ideas that were kind of popularized in the West with regards to how motherhood and feeding should happen, as well as established Chinese ideas about how infant formula should happen. So you've got this coalescing of both Western Western and Asian are both such massive groups that I think are losing a lot of the nuance involved here, but just for the sake of this discussion, we're having the emergence and the, what's the word I'm looking for? They find a neat way of working together. And I think that that's really fascinating, because you realize that some of how we've been speaking about milk and infant formula has been incredibly focused on North America in particular, and somewhat in Europe. But there's more to be said and there's more to be understood. And considering that China is the fastest emerging consumer of all, agricultural products, we need to, I think, start thinking a bit more about what that means.
So one thing that was really interesting about the paper, and I'd like to move out and ask a slightly bigger question now, is that this is very much a paper written by you, an animal studies scholar, and someone else who doesn't come from an animal studies background.
Mm-hmm.
And right at the end of the paper, you mentioned that there's certain frictions in the way that you might have approached this and the way that Caroline might have approached this. So how did you remedy that, given that we as animal studies scholars might often find ourselves working with research partners who maybe aren't inclined to use the lenses that we use?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, broadly speaking, anyone who works interdisciplinary is going to find themselves working with folks that have lenses that aren't the same as theirs. And figuring out how to navigate that is, I think, an important way of knowing the world better and having a more comprehensive understanding of the world. But I think some of where the friction, and this was good friction, I think friction is not always bad, right? There can be, and this is the Foucauldian influence coming up, but there can be productive potential in friction, right? There is something to look at, those moments when you don't quite agree. And again, this came up in Gerard's work. Look at those moments where you don't quite agree and there's something productive in there. That's where the moments of action come in. It's easy to just gloss over and say, we work together. No, we need to actually pause and think a bit about why there are these moments of friction. And they're not, I actually think that they made the paper better and they made us more reflective throughout the paper, because I have a variety of assumptions and Carolyn has a variety of assumptions that are based on our own histories, individual and academic and disciplinary, that shape the way we view things. But I just want to say that this is not just a matter of an animal studies lens. There's an animal studies lens, and increasingly I'm seeing this even at conferences I go to. And then there's also the critical animal studies lens. And I've realized that this positions me somewhat differently, not only in relation to other scholars, but even in relation to some other animal studies scholars. I became vegan a few years ago, and this has fundamentally changed the way I see the world. I see animals and I see the ways in which they're included in agricultural industries and the ways in which they're worn by people. And for me, this is a big problem that needs to be addressed. I don't just see pork, I see a pig. And that's a fundamental I would try and explain it to me 5 years ago, and I don't think I would have gotten it 5 years ago. It's not something that's easily apparent. And I had the same thing when I had to contend with the idea of feminism, right? You have this idea that, oh, because I'm a woman, I'm a feminist. It wasn't that easy, actually. I had to struggle with the idea of what does it mean? What does feminism actually mean? What are the politics of feminism? Just like what are the politics of veganism? And it was a worldview that I had struggled towards. And then once I had, I think, several kind of breakthroughs, it was a worldview that I could no longer break away from. It literally shapes the way I see the world, the ways in which I see our relations and animals' relations with one another. So kind of having that critical stance in the ways in which I'm based, it makes it's not even just academic, it's even personal. Like it's a hard thing for me to have. So having Carolyn there also to check me as well and see, well, how, why, and to ask the questions, right? Things that I take for granted is really helpful in terms of me thinking in a more nuanced way. So I tended to not, I think, trouble the human as much as I should. I tend to treat humans as a monolithic group, which I know like Jason Moore with the capitalist scene has been critiqued for in the past, for example, where it's one thing to blame humans, but it's not humans. It's actually very particular activities and practices that are creating these unequal things. She really aided me in kind of developing these ways of thinking. On the other hand, so as much as I think, Carolyn helped me, and we all need help. We don't see the world fully. I mean, this is something that we're saying even in the paper. We have partial views of the world, and we need to say, okay, there's nothing wrong with it. I personally don't think we will ever see anything completely, but we can see things more fully, and we can be more nuanced in our appreciation of them. Whereas with Carolyn, I think I assisted. She comes, just like I see the world in a very different way based on my critical stance with regards to animals, she's got a very critical stance when it comes to colonialism and the ways in which the world is structured. And this is a view that's, even though I come from South Africa that has a colonial history, it's not something that's foregrounded in South Africa the way it is in Canada. So I learned a great deal from her with regards to that. But at the same time, I think I aided her in thinking through how to speak about animals in a way that foregrounds them. And there are small things in the paper. So, for example, cow's milk or goat's milk. It's a tiny thing, but I actually think it's really important is we would go COWS apostrophe. The possessive wasn't a singular cow, but multiple cows. Tiny move, but for me, this was really an important thing to highlight that there's not one individual. Milk is just not this blob of stuff. It's actually multiple individuals that are caught up in these industries. So it's things like that I helped her through thinking through. And I think both of us walk away from this paper being better scholars for it. So I think there is value in embracing the friction and not walking away from what are difficult conversations and pausing to think, what does that mean? How can it make my scholarship better? And how can it make me more accountable and responsible in my own life, even? Because these are important things we're talking about.
Yes, and that's a glowing endorsement for interdisciplinary work and interdisciplinary conversations, which leads me very neatly to some questions I wanted to ask you about podcasting. So for those listeners who haven't encountered the animal turn, could you introduce us to the podcast?
Yeah, I'm going to poach your listeners now. No, I'm joking. We are very supportive of one another. I absolutely love knowing animals, and a big inspiration for developing the Animal Tone podcast was Siobhan's Knowing Animals. I think you mentioned the award at the beginning of the episode, and I just wanted to say, thank you so much to Asa for the award and to Siobhan for establishing the award, for putting up money to make this possible, because I think she's been instrumental in creating infrastructure for animal studies scholars, for making people actually talk and carve out a space in which can sometimes be, it's increasingly less lonely, but sometimes you're the only person in a department or one of only two people in an apartment. And having these networks and having these awards it goes a long way in terms of valuation, but in terms of the infrastructure that's needed to make the world a better place for animals, I think.
Absolutely.
But the Animal Turn podcast is slightly different to Knowing Animals in that it's a long form. So I do hour-long interviews with people, and it's centered around specific, or at least an hour. They're stretching out a bit. As you can tell, I have a way of just talking. They are centered around specific concepts. So each season, I have a season that focuses on a particular theme, and then every season has 10 episodes, and every episode is focused on a specific concept, with the 10th episode having a grad review where we look at some of the core themes and tensions that came up throughout the season. And I hope that this is a pedagogical tool for both individuals in terms of learning about animal studies, but hopefully something that people who teach courses on animal studies could use in future, supplementary material to go similar to this in some ways, to go with a paper, to go with thinking about this, because you learn differently when you're listening to the person speak about it. So the first season was Animals and Law. The second season was Animals and Experience. The third season, which just rounded up, was Animals and the Urban, and I'm currently doing a season on Animals and Sound, which is really far out for me, but it's been fascinating to kind of think through. I'm almost at 2 years, and it's really exciting.
Who have you been talking to? What kinds of people have you been talking to about animals and sound?
Animals and Sound has been fascinating. So far, we've had the first episode was with Brian Pajanowski, where we spoke about soundscapes and what is a soundscape. And then I had Jonathan Pryor and Mickey Valley, where we've spoken a bit more about kind of sonic methods and bioacoustics. And later on in the season, I think we're going to go more into thinking about, what is sound and how do animals experience sound and things like music. But it's been fascinating because I think sound is currently very much in an ecological realm, and it's breaking into kind of thinking through things. And this is a word I always get wrong, phenomenologically. Anyone who's listened to season 2 knows that word, because it really does open up your world differently. If you go outside and you just sit and you listen, the ways in which animals become apparent to you is very different to when you go out and you look. You get a different sense of rhythms, you get a different sense of communication, you get a different sense of the ways in which animals are in the world. And I think it's a really creative way of thinking, well, how do we start to, I think, descend to the visual a bit, because animals experience, just like we do, the world through multiple senses. We smell, we hear, we see. And I think starting to think through how these could help us in understanding animals, their experiences, and our relationships with them is really important. I'm learning a lot. It is far out from what I know. And I think I've learned a lot from sound by doing the podcast. And this is kind of the interdisciplinary thing that you're talking of, is I'm speaking to people about things I actually know very little about, and it's rejuvenating. It's excellent. It gives really cool new avenues for thinking that I think could be transformative.
Yes, definitely. Have you got any plans for future seasons? I assume there'll be more seasons after Sound.
Yes. So there is the next season is going to be on biosecurity, which I think is really important. And I suspect you might have a thing or two to say about biosecurity, Josh.
I have a lot to say about biosecurity.
Yes. So maybe we'll have a conversation in future. So biosecurity is coming up. I've managed to find a sponsor, because I'm trying to develop, I think, a slightly different sponsorship model. So the podcast has been, since the beginning, sponsored by Apple, which is a fantastic research group. You were with them at Queen's University, and they've helped me in establishing this podcast too, with Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson. And they've been a long-term sponsor of the podcast, kind of giving enough money to cover operational costs. And I'm developing and going into the realm now where I want to make this more established and have longevity. So you need to start thinking of funding models. It's just the reality. Podcasts take time, and I want to make sure that I do it well. I'm starting to think about ways in which that could happen. And I think focusing on research groups and people that are actually applying for grants, and ways in which, again, the pedagogical aspect of it, how could 10 episodes help a research project or a research group actually move forward? So yeah, I'm finding research groups now and thinking through, but I retain the right to choose who I'm interviewing. It's a collaboration, but you got to have your limits and your lines, because I don't want to lose the critical edge I have and the conversations that I'm having. So yeah, the next one's on biosecurity. And then there are some conversations for ones. I know I definitely want to do one on activism, and I definitely want to do one on history in future. So fingers crossed.
Oh, that's fantastic. There's obviously a lot of great things happening there. And to repeat, this is an award-winning podcast. This is definitely one that if you're interested in animal studies and you like the kind of things we do in Knowing Animals, you should definitely be checking this out. Now, Claudia, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I should be, but are you ever ready for 5 quick questions?
Oh, well, I listened back to my own answers recently, and that was a mistake.
I feel like every time you could ask me these every month for the next year, and I would probably answer differently every time. So, yeah, which says something about me. I don't know, but yes, let's do this.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
It might have been Donna Haraway's manifesto. What's it called?
Companion Species Manifesto.
Yes. Now that I think about it, that might have been the first animal studies, but the first one where I think I was actually cognizant and thinking, aha, wow, animals, was possibly Jim Mason and Peter Singer's book, The Ethics of What We Eat. Again, not necessarily overtly about animals, but I think an exceptional book that unpacked kind of people's diets and did commodity chain analyses, like went back, what are the ethics of these? It didn't give neat answers, didn't say this is ethical, this isn't, but kind of left it open-ended for what are the ethics of what you eat.
And can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. It's this one. So I'm kind of new to animal studies actually, which is why the podcast was neat because it allowed me to speak to people. So yeah, it's this. This is the first bit of legitimate pro-animal study scholarship stuff I've ever done.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Now, I do think you need to be more specific about the word impact because there are a lot of people, I think, that have impacted things. And I'm going to take liberties here, like everyone does, to say, I think the work of Catherine Gillespie and Yamini Narayanan have been, and their work both together and separate as separate scholars has been instrumental in terms of shaping how I think. Cowith, ETAG 1389 by Catherine, I think just it really is a stellar example of how to put animals at the forefront of what you're doing and how you're writing and how to still, without neglecting the structures that shape their worlds. So I absolutely cannot recommend that book enough. And her writing. And Yamini Narayanan similarly has a very, very fantastic, great English, very fantastic way of both privileging animals, but also of showing the scholarship. And as someone who's interested in the urban, Yamini does this in a brilliant way. So as people who I enjoy reading and who have shaped my ideas them, I think Paula Akari, some of her ideas with regards to invisibilization are just absolutely fascinating. But who have impacted me personally as well, I would say Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka have just been, it's not necessarily, I mean, their work is fascinating to read, but as people who have been open to the world and also in terms of creating spaces for animal studies scholars, as people who are learning about it, they've been massive impacts. I cannot thank them enough. I would consider them friends, and I think the informal conversations with them are also just instrumental in terms of shaping my work and what I think is significant.
Yeah, it's a fantastic list of names, no doubt about it. So what do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
So I think that responsibility is important. Responsibility is hard, and it's hard in a variety of ways. It's hard in terms of when you look at a commodity in your hand or you look at a relationship you have, taking responsibility for your role in it is a hard thing. And I think as academics and just as people in general, we could all do more to take responsibility and think about how we are part of things, right? There are not big, bad worlds happening out there. We are part of things. So I think taking responsibility, and for me, one of the ways in which I've done that is to look at what I eat and veganism. And that, as I've said throughout the show, has not just shaped my personal life, but very much shaped my scholarship and the ways in which I privilege animals. So I do think that that's a really important thing that folks could do. But as scholars as well, I think we could carve out spaces that make animals more apparent in spaces where they're not. So if you see a conference about politics or about food and no one's talking about animals, I think that's an intervention. You should go there and you should take up some space and actually talk about animals in spaces where they're not spoken of, because it is an interdisciplinary conversation. And I think learning to think and talk in these ways is hard. It is hard. And I think the more we have these conversations, the easier it gets. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but it feels okay.
I think that's an excellent answer. And I mean, of course, I'm very proud of much of my animal work and the work I do at conferences focused on animals. But in some ways, I feel like my proudest work is when I join a debate that has never included animals before and say, hey, well, what about when we add this in? you know?
Mhm.
So a question that's never really been talked about in animal circles, perhaps, is one that we can thrust into a non-animal circle. We can
Yeah.
join a conversation that's already there, and I think that's so important.
Where did I mention this somewhere else? But I'm often startled by how often people are speaking or there are conversations happening about environmental science, and there's no conversation about agriculture happening.
Yeah.
It baffles me. Like, how is there not a conversation about fossil fuels and agriculture happening in the spaces where people are actively understanding climate change? That seems like a massive oversight. So having someone who's standing in the room, and it's not easy to necessarily be that person, right? Yeah, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to make some noise and have some thick skin about it. Yeah.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I mean, it would be our relationship with animals, and our in a problematic kind of sense, like who is that? But I just don't want to hurt them as much. I think there's always hurts and there's pain in life. I think that's somewhat part of life, but I think we use that saying too much. I think we could do more to hurt them less. And if there was one thing I could change, it would be that, to just have a little less pain and a little more niceness. I think the world would be a better place if we were all just nicer to each other and to people, and to take, again, responsibility for our roles and actions in that. So if there was one thing, it would be the speed with which we decide to kill and hurt. I think to take responsibility for our roles in that.
What are you working on next?
My thesis, which again, I said it when I accepted the award. I have a tendency of doing a bazillion things because it's infinitely fascinating and I think important. But for now, I'm going to hunker down and focus on my thesis, and I'm developing some ideas around that. So my thesis is actually looking at how cows were removed from the urban. That was the primary thrust, because I did a small walking tour, a historical walking tour of Kingston, and I realized there were as many cows as there were horses. I was like, that's fascinating, because horses are really part of people's urban imaginaries, but cows are not. So it started as a pursuit of trying to understand how they were removed, and what underlying factors kind of shaped that. And it's kind of morphed, I think, into more of a methodological realm as well, in terms of thinking of how can we know historical animals, and how can we tell those stories that actually foreground animals and not just the traces of them, like milk or meat. So that's what I'm working on now, and hopefully some side papers and things. 2022 is the year. I need to get this done, and I'm really excited. Working through the data has been fascinating.
Yes, not to take you away from that important work. You're also involved with the Bovine Research Network, is that correct?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the Bovine Scholarship Network, myself and Andrea Petit, who's with Human Animal Group, also a studies group in Sweden, we have interesting overlaps, again, not neat, but interesting overlaps with regards to cows. And we decided more people should be speaking about cows, because really, again, in the moments of climate change and in the moment of ethical and violent relationships, I think there's some work to be done about kind of privileging specific animals and having different groups from different disciplines speaking about them. So we launched the Bovine Scholarship Network, and it's really brand new. It does have a home on the Humanities Commons page, so you can check that out, sign up if you're interested in cows or yaks or any sort of bovine group. And we're going to have an upcoming workshop in March. So our workshops are very open, and they're very much focused on actually having conversations, not necessarily presenting papers, but thinking through difficult ideas. And yeah, it's brand new, it's fledgling, but we're really excited after the workshop in October. So yeah, we've got that going on. No papers, but definitely working on that and starting to figure out, again, building some infrastructure.
And how can people find out more about your work and as well about your podcasting?
I'm still kind of developing my own stuff. I haven't got much to show for Claudia, the scholar. I do have a Google page and on academia.edu and stuff like that. But the podcast is probably the place to go. So the animaltonepodcast.com. We've got a website that's got tons of additional resources. You can find out more about me and the podcast there, and the Bovine Scholarship Network on Humanities Commons. And I will work on getting a centralized place for me soon. But yeah, you can also email me. I think I'm fairly easy to find online.
Well, thanks, Claudia, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you for having me. And thank you once again to you, to Siobhan, to Asa for the support, and for the fantastic work you all do, and for letting me waffle on your platform a bit. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Also, don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast where you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.